we do have to finish at 2 o'clock. And in a way, I think the problem with raising the issue of accreditation is that, it's not at all a controversial issue with students. Indeed, I think the problem is students hardly know anything about it. And hopefully this session, was to have been a kind of more educational intervention, I think, to describe to students what the process of accreditation was, and in particular to kind of alert them of the sort of struggle between RIBA and ARB, and why we would obviously wish to support RIBA. And it's interesting to see, looking around the room, that there are far more people who are concerned with the documentation of the AA for the process of accreditation, and I think that's I think we should just get on with it. And I should ask, because of who's here, it's hardly any necessity to introduce Simon. So I'll kind of cut it short by not really doing so, but to welcome him and thank him for kind of coming to discuss this with us. So I should hand over immediately to Simon.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just come from a talk upstairs to Mike Weinstock's group about architecture. And I think, for me, that one of the key things about the notion of accreditation is I'm a practicing architect. I happen to be honorary treasurer, soon to retire from the AA. I've recently been roped into becoming vice president for education at the RIBA. But my primary driver, the thing that keeps me going, is practicing architecture. But for the previous 15 years, I was also teaching architecture at the Bartlett down the road, under Peter Cook, who's talking here tonight, under his regime. And I just thought it might be worth spelling out a number of things that may be obvious to people in the room, but maybe not to some. The first point is that architectural education, as this 2 week at the AA is about, is a shifting model. There is no fixed or standard model that we should follow. And in a sense, I think that's one of the great things about architectural education in this country, is that there are, I think it's 37 schools of architecture, and they all construct their own model. There isn't a centralized national curriculum for architecture, but there is a system of validation and accreditation of the different models that are being run. The benefit of that system, in my opinion, is different schools, as you well know from the rivalry between all the schools, friendly sometimes, sometimes not, will pursue different ideas. They'll have different teaching methods, and within years or unit structures, quite different approaches to what architecture is or could be become important. I always think, and we have a lot of students come to our office and then go on and get qualified or get their RIBA Part 3. I always think there is a sort of more recent divide. Is it 1958 Oxford Conference, where there was a sort of, previously schools of architecture were in the minority, and a lot of people were articled into offices where they then worked in the evenings at Regent Street Poly or whatever, so they were both practicing and studying, and there's a sort of terrible danger of the current model being accepted as the only model. I think it's a danger financially, because 5 years of studying under current student funding regimes, and all the students here will know that, because student funding regimes here are more different than anywhere else in terms of the government recognised idea of what education is and who will fund it and how. All those things are going to lead us to question, not just in the AA, but beyond, who can teach, how they teach, and what's the responsibility of practice. And the worst thing of the current model is that there is 5 years of intense academic inquiry, and then at its worst, I think it's not that uncommon, a sort of dip into the depression of practice, where practice is deemed to be without ideas, mundane and contractual. I think part of the reason for that generally is the malaise of practice, and I think there's a lot of talk about practices being unhappy with the students who come into practice. I think the students could be unhappy in some of the practices they go into. Is that there is a divide at all. There is this divide of that's an academic inquiry and this is a professional practice inquiry, and they are distinct. And I've never seen them as distinct, and I'm sure that's why a lot of people support the work done at the AA and what this school is about, which is actually about a lot of the inquiries that go on here might then emerge as units, spawn students and spawn more units, or indeed people who've started to teach increasingly get into practice, so that there becomes a very healthy mix between what you could possibly achieve. The danger, as I see it, of accreditation as it's shifting is that the idea of government control and risk. Now, there's been the AA is a charity, there's been a ongoing review of how that charity operates, and is that legal, could it be challenged in different ways? And the danger is that is simply a reflection of a legal world we live in. So Hugo was just talking about the American elections and lawyers now beginning to pore over the results. And actually that kind of manipulation of inquiry and fact and supposed democracy is what is going on in the world of architecture. So increasingly, in the world of practice, we are audited. We are audited by our insurers, we are audited by our clients, we are audited by the health and safety executive, and we are audited by planning authority, we are audited by building control, and all that we do, all our procedures, and what we produce, which is actually what we're all interested in, is being attacked. So you have to develop, in a sense, weapons to deal with this attack, because the key concern in a lot of academic work is the idea of pushing the envelope, pushing the boundaries, making inquiries. Innovation is a dangerous world that's been hijacked by the government recently, so they'll talk about the movement for innovation, which is actually the movement for better filing. I think actually this kind of, the thinking that goes on in here is increasingly being curtailed outside unless you develop stealth and tactics to get through it. So governance and risk will impact on what we do. And rules and regulations will impact on what we do. And a lot of rules and regulations, be it the density at which you redevelop, the architecture you might use to redevelop, will actually begin to control things and how you do it. And you will actually find what I call stealth planning. You develop buildings almost through a secretive method, so no one's quite aware of what they will get until they've been revealed. So you'll learn continuously in life now how to circumvent these rules and perhaps turn them to your advantage. Perhaps you use them as a deterministic system that you have the wit to criticize and reinvent. But a key idea at the moment is that in this country, I mean in other countries people say it's much better, architecture is better protected because architects are legally obliged to sign certain sets of documents or drawings, and clients can't build without that. And that's good for their profession, they will say, because that profession has higher standing and esteem. I think we'd all acknowledge that much as we love the architectural world, actually the legalisation and protection of architecture is not going to come from a regulation. And indeed, there's no reason in my view that someone called an architect should have the exclusive rights to make architecture. Architecture is made by different people in different ways at different times, and they certainly don't need to be professionally qualified. Joseph Paxton, you know, a great inventor of industrialised architecture, never set foot in a school of architecture. From Logier's Primitive Hut to Cedric Price's Fun Palace, the idea there was architecture is not always a solution. Architectural education might be about opening up ideas. But a professional parochialism has crept into the idea of what we should be. And I think architects hate the idea generally of being corporate. Even the idea of being overly efficient is kind of deemed to control creativity. Not something I would agree with. But there is a danger of professional parochialism, and that parochialism has been established by the architectural profession. In 1931, an act was passed that protected the title architect, but not the activity. So what you got is, you can call yourself an architect, and no one who isn't qualified can call themselves an architect, but anyone can practice architecture. Now my point is, I agree, anyone could practice architecture and let society, critics, users be the judge of whether that is making architecture or just building, or whether that architecture is successful. So I think at the moment we are caught in a trap where we've protected the word and the title architect and not protected the idea of architecture. And the people to protect architecture are schools of architecture who teach and encourage people to inquire about what architecture could be, rather than anyone who tries to define it. Because if you define anything at a moment in time, you're going to define it on past models rather than future potential. So there's a fundamental decision that I think the school and its constituent parts need to think about as individuals is, are you actually into the idea of architecture being something that you do through your skill and knowledge, or you do because only you can do it because it's protected? So my personal take on that is resist the idea of protecting title, because the activity of architecture will be protected by future assessors of architecture. We live in a world with dodgy words being used. Benchmark is one word, so everything's benchmarked now. Clients have become customers, so we're almost like a sort of an electricity producer, producing architecture for consumption, which again isn't the case, because the people who commission architecture aren't necessarily the people who will utilise the architecture. And as architects, we are caught between dealing with people who pay us and the other group of people that we think might matter to the cultural programme of our buildings. And we have to satisfy, to be successful, both parties. So in a sense, we are working in a world of excessive regulation that I think works against creativity, which is what the AA is all about. At the same time, we have to recognise that that world exists and think how we can use it to improve what we do, and who might we look to support what we do. So at the moment we're being told we drink or smoke too much, or we're too fat, would like to have a nationalised curriculum, so it's everything standardised. And the danger of standardisation is that you drag everything down to the lowest possible common denominator. And that common denominator is a centralised, approved national curriculum. Once you have that national curriculum in place, invention and criticism, in my opinion, will go out the window, which is why I do, as I said before, think that a large number of schools with different agendas and drives and staff with different programmes and different interests is healthy. At the same time, students are committing themselves to a large amount of money and time to get educated within an academic system. And students, I think, rightly, naturally, and perhaps sometimes cynically, as sort of court cases will show, are now often perceiving education as something they're buying. It's a service that they're buying, and at the end of that year, if they're unsuccessful in the sort of continuation into the next stage of their academic education, they may well turn to lawyers to think about, you know, were they given the right background, the right education? And all that kind of risk and auditing that goes on in practice is increasingly impacting on what goes on as what I would call the consumption of architecture by governance. And I think that is a serious issue. So where we are at the moment in the UK is that we have a large number of schools who look to the RIBA validation board to validate their courses. So RIBA Part 1 exemption is attached to approved schools. So a School of Architecture gives a degree, and that degree is Part 1 exempt. So you've acquired, with your degree, a professional exam. I think there are academic models where you might say that's very restrictive in architecture, and perhaps it limits who comes in. And actually, when people come into architecture education, they may come out thinking, I don't want to be an architect, and why should they be? So there might be another model where you say, can we have a degree, and a good degree, but not Part 1 exemption? And that again gives more flexibility for people to pursue architecture as a discipline that intrigues them without naturally thinking they're going to go through and become a professional. They then go back and do RIBA Part 2 exemption, which is the AA's or the Bartlett's or Sheffield's or Manchester's diploma course. So you get your diploma, you've acquired another academic course with a grade in some schools, not in others, and that gets RIBA Part 2 exemption. So you're now ready to go out into the professional world of practice. Then you go into gaining experience in an office or on your own or whatever it might be, and then you can seek to do RIBA Part 3, which means you are then qualified to become an architect in title. It doesn't mean you or I think that person's necessarily a good architect, but they are then qualified as an architect. Their title only is protected. The current battle that's now going on is the architectural profession since 1931 and then 1991 and 1997 has always argued that they'd like to protect title. The reason is that a lot of practitioners in the UK are small single-person practices or less than 3 or 4 people, the vast majority, and a lot of those people think protection of title means that when someone goes to find an architect to do something, the word architect is not ours. It's ours only, I mean. And other people can use the word architectural designer, and that's perfectly fine. And that seems to me reality. So the idea of actually saying, if someone wants to get architecture on the cheap or believes they can get it from someone else better than an architect, I don't think they're going to turn around and ask to use an architect simply because they've got a stamp or a validation stamp. So what's happened since 1997 is that ARCUT, which was the Architects Registration Council United Kingdom, was disbanded. That was basically a body that kept a record of who was an architect, who had Part 1, Part 2 and Part 3. They became an architect and their title, but not their activity, was protected. The profession supported the idea that a new body would be formed called the Architects Registration Board, which the profession thought would follow a similar line. It would protect the title architect. And again, it can't protect the activity. No one can stop someone building something simply because they haven't got an architect involved. What has happened is, like a lot of government bodies, they've become hungry for more opportunity to generate a larger civil service fund, to generate employment, to fulfill the government goal of control and regulation. So now the Architects Registration Board has started saying it would also like to control who should come into the profession. So instead of the RIBA, which for all its faults as a gentleman's club trying to become a people's club, trying to become an architecture centre, the RIBA and the Architects Registration Board are now at loggerheads, because the Architecture Registration Board wants to start controlling what you teach and how you teach it, and perhaps to drive it towards a standard curriculum, a nationalised form of education, which will lead to a nationalised profession. And the government's interest in this is the government is long-standing the largest client of construction in this country, and at the moment, under what I think is a very unsatisfactory method called private finance initiative, they are trying to fund schools, hospitals and housing under a sort of lowest outturn cost benchmark centre price, which basically means they feel that a profession of vision is a profession potentially of danger, and they would rather turn out what I think is the very antithesis of what a school like this, or indeed any good school, wants. They're trying to turn out what I would call professional fodder, that is, capable, detailing, contractually skilled architects, not people who inquire. Now, there is a counter side to that, which is that as a profession, since sort of Soane began to define it, and the RIBA came into being, and the Architectural Association came into being because they weren't happy with the articled inquiries they were getting within offices, the counter side to this is the profession has lost ground. It has lost ground because of governance, statute and legality. The profession has lost ground, and we've spawned off surveyors, we've spawned off quantity surveyors, we have lost management and control of projects. So the professional input that we have has been curtailed, because the way we build and the money involved in building and the nature of insurance and the legal profession is such that we are actually forced to become more and more specialised in our provision. I think creative inquiry and professional competence are not separate things, but the previous educational conferences have in a way split up academe and practice, whereas in fact I think we're much richer for both if practice was more involved in academe and getting the benefit of the inquiry, which is why practices tend to stagnate and schools tend to polarise into creative forces alone. So I think there are reasons why we need to continuously rethink what we're teaching and how we're teaching, whether the AA is more involved in what's going in London, or as an international school, what's going on in the rest of the world. So I don't think the current model is fixed and perfect, but I think it is significantly better than the model that's being offered in the future, which is that a government curriculum approved by the government, controlled by a consumer-led body. So of the Architects Registration Board, of the 15 people, the majority are consumers of architecture. So they are people who see architecture as a means of controlling mistakes. But in fact, once a year they sue 10 small architectural designers who call themselves architects and 1 or 2 small practitioners who've actually made a mess. The reason they do that is it's too expensive to actually sue malpractice. So the people who sue malpractice are not the registration board anyway, it's the clients. They have the money to sue malpractice. So in fact, the Architecture Registration Board, in my opinion, has become an anachronism, which leaves the battle that the RIBA and the ARB are about to embark on actually very, very important to an institution like the AA, because the impact of one or the other side being successful in that is that what you teach and how you teach, instead of being discussed and informed by your agenda against an overall idea about validation, will become a prescribed course. So going to the AA would probably suffer more than most, because if its creative edge is crushed, it's probably the most expensive school to go to if you're a UK student. So, and certainly even if you're a foreign student compared to some of the provincial schools. So that battle that is about to commence is very, very important. I think for the AA to think about, therefore, my recommendation would not be whether it supports the RIBA or ARB on validation. I would say there's no question support the RIBA's position on validation. But then the school itself, as an international school with a large number of international teachers and students, should begin to think is how relevant are those qualifications to you? You get your AA degree, you get your AA diploma. Is the RIBA's exemption of relevance? Well, the RIBA is keen that it's of relevance because they're trying to export it as a brand around the world. So they have schools in Hong Kong, Singapore, one in Germany, some in Australia, some in Chile, who use the RIBA's accreditation as their international brand. There is no worldwide accreditation body for architecture, and in my opinion, by God, it would be very sad if there ever was. But so I think the sort of discussion should really be about the dangers of government nationalised education curriculum versus the perversity of difference that we now have in the current system versus the potential of the AA, if things go ways it doesn't want it to, doesn't believe it should go academically, could pursue alternative accreditations from somewhere else, or decide not to pursue accreditation at all. But on the latter point, I would just say that in a large number of countries in Europe, you need to be professionally qualified to practice. So the actual practice is more protected than it is here. And actually some form of accreditation is always likely to emerge. And if it doesn't exist, you can be damn sure some body will come up and start setting it up. So think about what bodies are available to you, think about the issues they bring on, think about the impact they will have on education, and ultimately think about the impact they will have on architecture.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for an extremely clear kind of statement of the issues, which I really think should actually be sort of printed and circulated to students who are not here, because I do think it's very important. Could we take questions? While people are kind of thinking what to ask, I mean, what is your sense of what will be the outcome in this kind of struggle between RIBA and ARB?
Well, my sense is that there's quite an interesting potential outcome. One is that it's an expensive business dealing with government, but one is you win the battle legally and you control ARB, return it to a registration body, and you decide as a profession whether you wish to relinquish the title architect. And the other one is if you can't win the battle, you pull out of using the title architect in your day-to-day operations. I don't think any architect of any credit who has any clients really ever shows their client their ARB certificate saying, I am a registered architect. So in fact, you could actually carry on practicing. The practice is not protected by anything. In fact, it's more controlled by insurance. So I think in a sense, there is a sort of ace card that exists for those who wished, which is to free themselves of that kind of statute. If they did that, of course, then you wouldn't need validation bodies and all schools would be independent. So it would have a series of potentially interesting knock-on effects.
That's just to follow that a bit in two different sorts of ways. One about the RIBAs. Would it be interesting, is it something that the RIBA is thinking about, that if it comes to a fight, that the RIBA might become, as it were, the Royal Institute of non-architects, that it would say to government and to our, well, actually, we're not fighting about the word architect. We are a learned institution, we are a professional body, we are interested in developing better thinking and debate about architecture. We will carry on doing that, and if you say we can't use the word architects, then we'll make a political issue of that. So that's one sort of fight. And in a way, that's parallel with the other fight you've suggested, which is that a school like the AA, more than any other school, because it hasn't got some university sitting on top of it saying you have to do this or that, could simply say, well, the AA diploma is good enough, as you've indicated, and say, well, and in a way say to the students, to what extent do you want us to fight for accreditation, or to what extent shall we go it alone? But as you pointed out, that raises then problems within European accreditation and other accreditations. But that is a mess anyway. So it may well be, I mean, the position I think a lot of students may take here is that if they're good enough and they're producing really interesting work, they will get work. They will go out and be designers of buildings and designers of bits of cities. It doesn't really matter what they call them. But perhaps, I mean, the first one interests me institutionally because there is this dogfight now developing between ARB and RIBA. Do you think the RIBA as a sort of final sanction would ever consider saying to government and ARB, well, actually, if you're just fighting about this attempt to protect title, then let's not bother about it. RIBA will continue as a learned body and will not be bothered with the name architect.
I mean, I have heard that, and I'm not an RIBA apparatchik, but I think I suppose I'm becoming one. I have heard a number of people over a number of years, people from here involved in the RIBA and other people, suggesting that there is ultimately that ACE card, and it's actually quite a useful card to have up your sleeve. I think there's a problem for the RIBA. I've got here a note, is it a gentleman's club? Maybe it once was. An institution, a trade union, and now it's trying to become perhaps an architecture centre. I think it has a problem that a large number of members of any institution see that institution as a protection to them. And I think a large number of those members equally see it as protecting their position as single practitioners or sole traders who might feel they are more exposed to the world of architectural designers or technologists selling architectural services. And it will then it'll have an issue with its membership, which I think it needs to review. I think there are two kinds of membership. The vast majority are people in small practices, and then there are large practices. It probably wouldn't affect the large practices, but might affect small practices who perhaps require more of a security blanket. I would point out, however, that I don't believe, from my own experience of clients at any level, that anyone will ever employ you simply because they think you're an architect. In terms of title, they will employ you because they think you're any good, or unfortunately, if they think you're cheap enough.
But perhaps the real effect, I mean, comes not around that question of the title. I mean, I agree with you. It would seem to me that if you kind of translate the kind of struggle between ARB and RIBA into the educational kind of field, the danger is initially for public sector architectural education in the following sense. You know, that if ARB are going to arbitrate over the name architecture, in a sense, first of all, universities, and secondly, as it were, the kind of Ministry of Education, is likely to channel funds, as it were, to architectural education only in those cases where they have kind of ARB recognition. And that seems to me a kind of an appalling threat that hangs over kind of public sector architectural education. The fact that it doesn't apply to us, I mean, it seems to me shouldn't in any way diminish you know, our wish to express solidarity with other universities, because I think it's extremely important. Although, of course, in this particular instance, you could say that the AA would literally suffer less than the fate of public sector architectural departments. But I'm sort of like asking, do you think that's about right?
I think that's right. I think that's why the great battle has always been at the AA to maintain its independence of the university system. Yeah. And again, that horrible word, but it kind of also means the AA can always be a benchmark of difference. And actually, if the country didn't have a school that was able to independently operate outside the funding regimes, then you wouldn't have anything to compare and contrast with. And that is the AA's, in my opinion, its ultimate strength, because it can go up and down in quality and have good and bad times, but its ultimate strength is it sets a contrasting model to what would happen. And that's why it could become even more important if funds ended up manipulating education and sort of nationalising architectural education. I don't even believe in a national curriculum at any level, let alone in architecture.
No, I mean, that seems to me to raise, actually very profound kind of political problems. I mean, as it were, the identity between Thatcher and Blair is precisely sort of along this axis. I mean, of course, they're different for many purposes, but in this kind of mad centralisation under a kind of managerial kind of remit, they're almost kind of, the difference is undetectable. I mean, could we pose the question then again, within the AA, let's think about what you've described from the point of view of a student who's kind of come to the UK, come to the AA to study architecture. In a sense, they don't spontaneously have a kind of deep and abiding interest in this question, except, as it were, that I guess their concern is that whatever level of accreditation they're currently getting at the AA is one which enables them to practice when they go back, and they would be concerned with any change in that arrangement. So somehow, could I ask that question and ask you to sort of put it into a relation with the issues that you've described?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, like everyone else, we students do sometimes see themselves as consumers, because you are paying a vast amount of money in education, whether you're here or somewhere else. And the idea of being in an educational system and coming out, and if the AA was the only school in the country that didn't get any professional qualifications, I think that would affect the AA's success. As the AA relies on student numbers, I think it would probably, in the long term, do damage. I think students do, even if you look at units, successful units tend to be successful because they've been successful before, and students will tend to vote with their feet and go to the units that have been successful because they're spending a lot of money on education, which is entirely understandable, or time or emotional effort in education. I think the danger that would happen is if the AA was alone in being unaccredited. I'd also point out that when students come to work in England now, if they are in a non-recognised system, the ARB, who will give them Part 1 and Part 2 exemption, is now charging £995 a pop to get one or the other. So it's just making life more regulated, which is bad, and more expensive. And I think ultimately the cost of living in London are expensive. I think the AA cannot afford to be alone in being unaccredited or validated. And I think the AA is, a very, very strong name in the world of architecture, and that's its kind of great success. But I think it would be a danger if it doesn't stick with other schools it has some empathy with and actually kind of stick with them on this particular battle, because I think the AA would in the long term suffer.
I mean, the missing... Sorry.
I thoroughly agree. I think it's really important that the school keeps some form of accreditation, because not just because students would come anymore, but also because it gives a centre of gravity to the school. I'm not saying the RIBA curriculum or the RIBA curriculum do, but the notion of architectural studies, if you don't have that, then there is no... If it's much more of a learned society, then who do you choose out of the interviewing process to come to the school and things like that, and what is the kind of thrust of the work? So I'm saying it's a constraint. It's a thing from which architectural inquiry sort of takes up, gathers from, like a kind of set of barnacles, if you like. And so I think it's really important that there is some form of accreditation. I mean, when P. Cook down the road lost his diploma school accreditation a couple of years back, he said, oh, we won't bother with the RIBA. But I then noticed that he soon backtracked on that because he then would start losing all of his students if he didn't have some form of accreditation. So, I mean, in terms of just the practicalities of the finances of the school, we need some form of accreditation that people can decide that they want to study, make an architectural career and can come and they've got that to say that that's what they're doing. But more importantly, it is a constraint to a set of architectural inquiries, and without that constraint from which you can work out from, the school would swim.
I mean, just picking up on that, I would agree. I personally think there's the opportunity for architectural education to expand, if you think that's a good idea, by actually having inquiry which doesn't get accredited, if you see what I mean, so that people can do a very, very fine degree in a traditional university, get a first, but not get RIBA Part 1, because they just pursued a different way of thinking about it. And that you can separate the professional qualification from the academic qualification. But I think, although I think we live in a world of excessive governance constraint, both commercially and regulatory, I think architecture is a discipline that does respond to constraint, and I think the focus of the notion of professional practice is important to the ongoing idea of architecture. And I think one of the real sad things is the split between practice and academe. I think it exists in small cohorts of people who teach and practice, but far too much practice will cynically view young architects coming out as fodder, and the young fodder will cynically view the practice as, burnt out old timers. And I think the two being brought together in some way more positively would be also a very good thing. So I think, rethinking some of the ways we operate. I'd also point out that I know plenty of qualified architects who are completely incompetent, and plenty of unqualified, untaught people working in architecture who have far more to offer. So nothing guarantees anything, but taking the sort of vast bulk, the experience of education and the experience of professional qualification under a validated system is informative to the individual in a positive way.
I mean, I think that Peter's point in a way goes beyond that, in the sense that, I mean, if I understand him rightly, I mean, what it points to is that one of the significant elements for being accredited by RIBA at the AA is not that it controls, the curriculum or whatever, or guarantees anything really, but in a sense is a kind of what you might call a kind of symbolic gesture, that while on the one hand we're concerned obviously to jealously protect the independence of the AA, it's also a moment of expressing a kind of solidarity with architecture, and therefore with other schools of architecture, and in a sense, with the profession of architecture. And that has, it has, in some sense, complex effects. It has no one single, but it's what I would call a kind of an important symbolic element. The problem then is, how long do you tolerate it if and when it starts to challenge the actual independence of the educational program of the AA? I mean, I think it's an extremely difficult kind of issue. I mean, you did mention, I think it's worth at least people kind of treating it as a thought experiment, that if you took the view that the AA needed accreditation, but didn't want what was on offer in the UK, at least it could formally seek validation from abroad. I mean, insofar as everything ought to be looked at, I'm not advocating it.
Would it be possible to use the resources of the association, all the members and everything, to maybe form a secondary type of accreditation where we don't really recognize all the single elements that RIBA is looking for, ARB, but we look for our own standards and maybe even a higher standard of quality in the work?
I think it's possible as an idea, and I think it happens as a natural. The AA is a bit of a club. And I think it happens naturally through the kind of views and biases of the people who've come out and the skills and success of the people who come out, which the AA will always shout about. It's like institution upon institution upon institution. I mean, the Royal Institute of British Architects has talked about renaming themselves the Royal Institute of British Architecture. I mean, all these things that we're talking about, in a sense, impact on the day-to-day business of what we do as architects minimally. But the creeping malaise of governance is just coming further into this. So if the AA did form its own independent body, it would probably need to be ISO 9001 and quality assured and all these kinds of things to have any credibility at all, and then would just become exactly the kind of thing you don't want it to be. So I think the AA is an institution. The AA is an institution with a worldwide reputation on which it feeds and on which its alumni, survive and prosper. And I think that's its great strength. But the idea of actually then formalising another accreditation body just seems to me interesting but probably painful.
I think the idea of having a visitation from ourselves, I mean, it's kind of fairly blood-curdling as one witnesses kind of events like the assessment of the DRL by Pascal Schoening. It raises all sorts of possibilities, but undoubtedly there'll be blood on the carpet afterwards.
I think that the point is not so much to actually form something that puts a stamp on it, but more to set a higher level of I can't think of the word, it escapes me, but to have a higher level of quality almost in the work, that it exceeds anything that anyone is asking for, and that if it ever comes up to question, there'd be no question about it.
I thought the AA thought it did that anyway, didn't it?
Yeah, but it does it.
I don't know.
No, but the other problem is precisely as always, who validates the validators? I mean, validation always comes with a large kind of price tag, in that successful completion of the validation is according to the criteria which they set up. And I think we have entered a culture which is so pathological about its commitment to audit and whatever. I mean, one of the players who should be acting at this moment, but won't because of the corruption of the idea of the university, would be vice-chancellors who should all be saying, we protect our architecture departments and we're just not going to tolerate ARB. But that's the last thing they're going to do. If they say, oh, well, if you're, a more efficient and whatever way of us coping with our difficult architecture departments, they'll probably buy into it. But that is itself such a kind of melancholy reflection upon the mentality of vice-chancellors.
I mean, the Vice-Chancellor, I think it's worth pointing out that Cambridge, which dropped its Part 2, is now looking to lose its Part 1 and 3 because it doesn't think architecture is an academic discipline. So it's quite possible for architecture to tumble down into the provision of consumer servicing for the construction industry, which isn't how I think anyone at the AA would perceive it. And its most depressing level, I think that's the tendency of government in the way they procure buildings, is to see it that way. They've approached the construction industry about how they should procure buildings, and they see design, whatever they say, is potentially as a sort of bolt-on service. It's a hospital and it works and it's on budget, etc., and it's got some design add-ons. I think that's how design is being seen, as a sort of superficial design. I hate the word anyway, but it's seen as a sort of extra over to the process of construction, whereas I think most of us would imagine architecture is about ideas about building, cities, use, pleasure and delight. And also the AA's great strength is that there are lots of different camps within it, and who validates a validator and all that kind of thing. The danger is the AA clearly sees architecture as an academic discipline with a professional drive through it. But you don't have to leave the AA and be an architect. You've not failed if you were successful at the AA and didn't become an architect. And that seems to me a crucial idea to exist in education, is that you're not trained to be an architect. But for those who delight in making in one way or another some physical contribution to the environment, then, you know, that is still a core discipline, going back to Peter's point earlier. And I think that was something that the AO might lose if it distances itself from the activity of construction. And I think, to be brutally harsh, not about the AA, about the profession, is part of the reason that this whole conversation is going on, is because the profession has had lots of problems with wealthier players lobbying to take over some of the supposed power that architects have. And actually, one of the reasons the profession has its moments of difficulty, although it's increasingly popular in terms of student numbers and in terms of the popular imagination, is the inability of architects to move on and think about how they practice. And I think perhaps the AA could be more critical and involved in that, rather than sort of the danger of distancing itself into an academic enclave. I think actually engaging with, whether it be London or the international world, and engaging with the issues that exist in construction might actually enrich the AA's conversations. Because at the moment there is a divide. Some people walk around the end of the year show and say, yeah, it's all very nice, but it's candy floss. And that's not my view, but that view will exist. And I think the AA's got to be clear that actually the danger of imagining your avant-garde in the contemporary world is it's a sort of fantasy you're creating. And I think perhaps the AA and the profession generally needs to think a little bit more about ideas of costs and use and funding and lease arrangements and all those kinds of things to liberate themselves, which is why some of the bright people from the AA have ended up being clients, because they thought they were too emasculated as architects. We don't live in a world of post-war world where there were large architect-led clients running local authority architectural practices that were employing large numbers of people with ambition. We live in a world of government commissioning buildings through construction companies on a sale and leaseback basis, which is not necessarily the easiest world for architecture to engage in. The profession doesn't like saying it. PFI is, you know, a disaster waiting to happen, and we're kind of wavering between one thing and the other. We need to engage with being professional as well as engage with being delighting in academic inquiry. I think that's what the school should be doing regardless of accreditation.
I mean, could I just sort of supplement that with one point? Because one question, because it seems to me that, you know, if you track back into the 19th century, how can I put it? The wish of architects to become a profession, somewhat on the model of law, somewhat on the model of kind of medicine, was what you might call always already a failure. I mean, in that sense, architecture has always been a failed profession because it couldn't, as medicine and law could, kind of grasp control of the object that it was concerned with. And therefore, you know, it has a very kind of different history. Now, when you look at some of the functions of a profession, like to regulate entry in, you know, a number of things, often those were better done in the 19th century and 20th century by trade unions. You know, for example, you know, if you take a field like acting, equity has no difficulty making quite sure that anyone who kind of walks on the stage has an equity ticket. It's got nothing to do about accreditation. Do you know what I mean? You know, now, I'm not, you know, proposing as an overall kind of solution, but there's certainly aspects of architectural practice which it seems to me, you know, would have been just as well and possibly better served by trade unionization.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, I think it's an interesting point of inquiry. I think there is just the thing about that is the whole trade union idea goes about being protecting its members rather than developing. And it goes against the academic idea of architecture, which I think would then turn architecture purely into an articled business. Because I would say the trade union idea is you actually are developing and protecting from guilds onwards the idea of an operation, and in a sense it would kill off the potential of academic inquiry because it would be an irrelevance to that guild as a possible observation on that.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think that certainly in any modern construction of trades unionism, that's not a useful way to go. It was interesting, you're referring back to the 19th century debates, and they were very strong. And I remember that Norman Shaw, who was very well respected and well established an architect, was violently opposed to the formation of any form of professional body, calling it a substitute for competence. His position being that if you were good and you had relationships with your clients, the clients would like what you did. If they didn't like what you did, they would sue you or they would complain. And good architecture would come from that relationship between the designer and the client. And what you didn't need was some intermediary professional body telling the client it was okay because there was some sort of level of competence, and allowing the architect to relax and think, well, I don't really, as long as I've got my bit of paper. So that there was a very powerful debate then, long before ARB was formed. So that seems to be something that we should remember.
So that's the Norman Shaw card, the RIBA's Norman Shaw card, which is actually saying, fine.
Yeah, why bother?
Or the individual practitioner's Norman Shaw card.
Which I think is quite a strong position to take. At the other extreme, with this sort of argument about work being taken away from the architect, I think it was Robert Gutman in America who did a big survey of the American profession about 5 or 6 years ago, who came to the conclusion that within 15 years the architect would cease to exist in America, and largely in Europe as well when he discussed it here. By that he didn't mean that people wouldn't continue to design buildings, but the architect as the profession had developed from the 19th century to its current sort of very log-jammed professional and litigatory position and relation to clients was no longer a productive way either for the professional person to work or for the client to receive those services. And so it would actually be a lot better, and would probably happen naturally, that that model would die out. It doesn't mean that excellent people full of great ideas about design won't continue to find great clients and will do so in their own ways. So I think that's at sort of a higher level. There is a big debate there, and it's very noticeable when I'm teaching the 5th year final students about to go out. One of the key questions we debate is whether or not it's worth trying to get part 2 or even going on to part 3. And significantly, the shift is towards students saying, well, no, if I think I'm confident I've got a really good education, I'm confident I've got really good skills, I'm just going to go out there and do it. And it doesn't matter, I will find work, I will work with lots of different sorts of people, I'll combine with endless other sorts of types of people. I don't need to be an architect.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all. I don't think any architect I've ever met has ever got any work by having the title architect attached to them, or accreditation. They have got work through their skill, connivance, or ability. So that doesn't. I agree with you. I don't think having a title in any way will guarantee you an enjoyable or an unenjoyable career. I think going back to this point about solidarity, what becomes interesting is what is the model of education in the future? Should the practice of architecture be so divided with this year-out system going on? Is that particularly good? Is practice, a 30-year fester post the delight of being a student? All these kinds of things. And actually, the conversation is worth having, because I think actually most of us would admit that we can drive around any city and see a large number of buildings built by architects that we think are dreadful. So probably the majority of buildings. So there's nothing in the title or anything that guarantees quality. The danger, in my opinion, is that the markers of quality might be increasingly driven out and replaced by only mediocrity if we don't actually form some attitudes about what kind of accreditation we want and how, and maybe you need a slimmed down profession rather than such a large profession. Maybe you set higher standards. The idea that you suddenly left college and after 1 year or 10 years you're suddenly the finished product, and what is the marker that you're drawing? Anyone would hope that you were learning more as you went on, but you might admit that you become more jaded and have less creative spark. So I think one of the big ones to face up to is the problem that actually a large number of accredited schools and accredited professionals are not very good at architecture. Not to be too down on the subject.
Well, that sort of says it all, really. Is there a last question? Because I think we should kind of draw to a close. I'm sorry that there were not more students here, because it's been an incredibly kind of useful discussion. And somehow, I think during the year, you know, we should kind of invite you back to make a kind of longer presentation, because it's. I think one of the difficulties that students have is that they simply don't kind of know the elementary kind of situation, and therefore kind of fail to detect the importance it has, I think, initially for public sector schools, but inevitably for the AA. Simon, thank you very much
My
indeed.
pleasure.